Hello and welcome to the July 26th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Anthony Bardaway here with Romeo Kokratsky.
Hey, folks.
This episode will be quite a bit different from our usual ones. We've kind of told ourselves in the past that we are not a American politics podcast, but recent events has caused us to make an exception in this one case. There have been, well, a lot of developments in the United States, and they do relate to Ukraine. So the bulk of this episode will be describing where that goes into some pretty deep places.
That's right, ladies and gents. This is the obligatory American Politics Podcast.
Everyone else is doing it, so we have to as well. And if you find this topic interesting and would like to hear more about news from Ukraine, please go to patreon.com/UkraineWithoutHype so you can support us and help us make this podcast work. Thank you, and on with the show. But unfortunately, first, we do have to give our combat update, and this last week has not been very positive on the front line. Now, this first one comes a bit before last week. We could have brought it up in last episode, but it was still fresh, which was that the Ukrainian forces holding the eastern bank of the Dnipro River outside of Kherson in the town of Krynki have withdrawn. We have not talked much about the so-called river war in quite a while because it really just has been a grinding attrition war in this tiny village and other areas around the banks. But eventually, Ukrainian forces have decided that holding this area is no longer worth it. Casualties were heavy, very difficult to supply holding force across a river under artillery and drone fire, and the decision was finally made to end that. However, that is not the end of the river war. Ukraine still holds many areas within the various islands and tributaries that run it's a delta. We've talked about this in the past, but it's been a while, but a refresher. The end of the Dnipro River that ends into the Black Sea is a delta. And like all deltas, it's very winding. There's lots going on down there. And Ukraine still holds a lot of that delta. But on the full other side of the river at Krynki, no longer. However, at the same time, if you look south of there at Crimea, we've been giving updates throughout the past of this Russian ship being blown up to the point where we haven't always done updates on that. There have been whole Russian warships that have just gotten destroyed that we kind of passed over because we didn't have time to talk about them. It's such a common occurrence. In the past, we've talked about how much of the Russian Black Sea Fleet had been withdrawn out of Crimea, and it seems that it's official now. The Russian Black Sea Fleet no longer exists in Crimea, no longer in Sevastopol. Before, there was some in port, in dry dock, that kind of thing, and no longer. So the Russian Black Sea Fleet fully driven out of Crimea. However, multiple points along the front line Russia has made advances in. First, and most importantly, we have to talk about the Pokrovsk direction. This is the territory that Russia has taken after advancing out of Avdiivka. These advances have been slow and steady. And before the last time we talked about this, where I was talking mainly about the threat posed to the highway there. Luckily, there have not been very many advances closer to that highway, the road of life that supplies much of the Donbass front line. The Russians have not advanced toward it northwards in that way, but they have made pretty significant progress westward following the path of the railway. This advance has been fast enough that they have nearly caught Ukrainian forces in various pockets and encirclements. Yesterday, as of time of recording, there was news of 2 battalions of the 31st Separate Mechanized Brigade being caught in an encirclement. Encirclements are actually quite rare, at least on a large scale. Platoon size, smaller forces get encircled, but when you're talking about larger forces, battalion size, for example, typically, they are able to get away before that happens. They're quite rare and devastating when they do occur. So these 2 battalions of 31st were apparently encircled, but with the aid of other forces were able to successfully stage a breakout of that encirclement and into the relative safety of the Ukrainian lines. Though that 31st Separate Mechanized Brigade is the main force in that area still. The controversy there is that apparently the brigade commander did not give the order to withdraw, and the issue was forced upon him by his subordinates, which is not very encouraging for the future of that area. However, part of the reason for the speed of this advance is that simply there is not a lot in that part of Ukraine. We talked about this before after Avdiivka, where a lot of the area outside of it is very small villages and basically open steppe and farmland. They are nearing a larger town named Hrodivka that is likely better defended than some of these tiny, couple dozen house villages, and will probably have sharper defenses. So I'm hoping that the speed of this advance will begin to blunt after getting closer to it. But as always, we have these command problems. Elsewhere on the Donbass front at New York and Toretsk, the Russians have made further advances on here, although in terms of the grand scheme of things, what it came down to was that they're able to further solidify control of the southern portion of the town, which I had already basically said during the last update. They had taken much of the southern arm of New York, and now they've just kind of widened that and putting the forces to the east of the city under further threat. And finally, in the Donbass area, we can look at Krasnohorivka. Krasnohorivka is kind of to the south of much of the battles that we've been talking about and is very, very close to the 2014-2015 front line. This city has been very fiercely fought over, but Ukrainians are holding the last few blocks of it and are gradually making their withdrawal. Looking north towards Kharkiv and Kupiansk, the Kupiansk direction, Kupiansk being one of the main supply points for the Kharkiv-Luhansk part of the front, there was a breakthrough with Ukrainian lines at Pishchene. It is not especially deep, but that front had been relatively unmoving for so long that it is still worrying that an advance was able to take place there. Though in other parts of that front, Ukrainians have also made their own advances. And finally, on the Kharkiv front, Ukraine still continues to advance, although very slowly. And if you look at a map, it doesn't show up as well as it might have in previous weeks. But Ukraine does have the initiative there. So between this, we have some real problems on the Donbass front, while the Kharkiv front has that one issue with the further advance on Kupiansk, but otherwise has greatly stabilized. However, one last thing to talk about Kharkiv is that there has been a recent, it's hard to talk about, waves of missile strikes considering how frequently these attacks take place. But one that we can talk about is that Russia hit the offices of a Swiss demining group called Foundation Suisse de Ménage. So not only an NGO that Russia blew up the offices of, but an NGO from a declaratively neutral country whose only goal in the country in Ukraine is to make it so children don't blow up on mines. Russia wants children to blow up on mines, however, so they don't especially care about that mission.
Remember when the Russians would leave booby-trapped stuffed animals in deoccupied areas when they withdrew from Kyiv Oblast? Russians killing children.
So with that, and talking about the front lines, we now get into some rather winding and complicated section here about what exactly happening in the Republican Party.
And yes, we will talk a little bit about the Democratic Party as well. Full disclosure, I am a registered Democrat and a member of Democrats Abroad.
As am I.
And so I am in no way a neutral or objective observer of these events. I am absolutely 100% a Democratic Party hack.
So it goes. It's best to admit your biases going in. But in this case, biases are just reality. So the main thing that will be anchoring this around was the RNC, where they decided officially to make Trump the presidential candidate. But before we do that, we're going to talk a bit about what the decision-making process was going into the RNC, what the GOP's strategy is. And for this, it's very important to remember, the Republicans know it, we know it, everyone knows it, that Trump was not the most policy-effective president in the world. For those who don't like his policies, that was very much a good thing. But for those who wanted his policies, it was a bad thing. And the main issue that the Republicans saw this is that, well, they call it the deep state. I call it the administrative state, or just the government doing normal government stuff. The government is not just one person, is not just the president. There are cabinet members, heads of federal organizations, there are the bureaucrats, it's a very large animal, the U.S. government, and no one person can control that. So when Trump came in with his ideas, and Trump is not the most focused person in the world, he was able to be distracted, and a lot of his agenda simply did not happen. There were powerful people under him who acted against his agenda. There were bureaucrats and lawyers who said that your agenda is actually illegal. We cannot do that. Such as when he first came into office and tried to deport a bunch of Muslims, the immigration lawyers were very quick to mobilize and doused a lot of that flame.
Though not all of it, he was still able to enforce bans that were purely discriminatory on basis of national origin and appoint government officials that he did not statutorily have the authority to appoint.
Yeah, it still happened, of course, but going into a future Trump presidency, they realized this problem and they decided that they need to have Trump people, they need to have Republican ideologues in control at all levels of government. And how this relates to Ukraine, because we do have to talk about Ukraine, is that Trump often gets credit for giving lethal aid to Ukraine when Obama did not. We're talking largely about the Javelin missiles was the big one, although the Javelin missiles were not used until the full-scale invasion. But it wasn't really Trump who made that decision. He had the Secretary of Defense, former retired General Jim Mattis did. Jim Mattis, aka Mad Dog Mattis, which is not the kind of nickname that Marines give you lightly, was a bit of a hero amongst the U.S. military community, and more importantly to Trump, had some pretty famous falling outs with Obama, making him the perfect candidate to be Secretary of Defense. However, Mattis was very much an Atlanticist. He had commanded NATO for a time. And really, while he was in charge there, had basically full control over the Department of Defense, and the White House itself really did not have so much leverage over what he could do. So when Mattis said, and when the State Department and other agencies agreed with him to give aid to Ukraine, Trump really didn't put up much of a fight, and the White House didn't really have a counter proposal there anyway. So they just kind of went with it.
We basically lucked out that Trump could be distracted by a jingling pair of car keys. Unfortunately, Trump also realized that he can be distracted by a jingling pair of car keys, which takes us into our next point. As Anthony mentioned, the whole complete GOP takeover of most of the functions of the administrative U.S. federal government. Americans may have heard of a thing called Project 2025. This is a 900-page document released by the Heritage Foundation, a prominent right-wing think tank that literally spells out, again, over the course of 900 pages, the policies that the Heritage Foundation would like to see enacted by a second Trump administration and how exactly to achieve those enactments. Now, there's been a lot of airtime and ink spilled over concrete analysis of in-depth analysis of Project 2025, which we're not going to go into. We're not going to repeat it here. But as for its specific recommendations for Ukraine, the Heritage Foundation, at least, is aware that not all Republicans are on board with the let's sell out to Russia game plan. There are plenty of cold warriors and neocons that are unwilling to sign over American dominance that easily. And so for Ukraine, it just says, well, people disagree, which is in contrast to, again, the incredible detail that they go into almost every other policy recommendation.
Yeah, as it relates to Ukraine, they say, here are 3 positions that Republicans take, and we're not going to pick which one is correct. The thing with 2025 is that it's largely a wish list of everything the Republicans want. And where there is disagreement, they just kind of let the disagreement sit and not try to make a ruling on it on their own. However, the meat of it is really the idea that where there are parts of the federal government that could potentially put up resistance to the Republican or Trump-specific policy goals, make sure that one of our people is in charge there, a complete replacement of the quote-unquote deep state, as they say. And that includes wanting to turn a lot of the nonpartisan, non-political functionaries within the government into officially partisan positions that will allow them to replace them with an incoming administration, when usually most of the government is just people doing the job of government, and it doesn't matter who.
One of the explicit goals of Project 2025 is that they want to actively remove the kind of nonpartisan nature of civil service in America. They explicitly want to replace the grand majority of civil service leadership positions with people not based on merit, but turn them into basically political appointees to ensure that they can push forward and remove obstacles for whatever ideological nonsense the administration is trying to pull. It is, again, almost the core of the project here, is to replace the civil service with basically a rubber stamp for a Republican administration, in this case, if it comes to pass. But beyond, aside from that, all that, and aside from the kind of fence sitting that the Project 2025 authors attempt to do with Ukraine, we can actually take a look at what Heritage has previously said on Ukraine, and may not shock you that they are against Ukraine aid, that Heritage materials are often translated into Russia and passed around what passes for the Russian intellectual classes. Tons of their authors have ties to Russia or have attended pro-Russian or Russian events. So while they may claim to be fence-sitting, recognizing that the GOP itself is split on the question of military aid to Ukraine, Heritage itself has a pretty strong anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian history.
Yes, and one of the criticisms people are saying about Project 2025 from the Republican side of things is that it is just Heritage Foundation saying it, and Trump has kind of tried to distance himself from it. He has often criticized Project 2025, but that was only after it was pointed out how everyone seems to hate everything in it. But even if he has some issues stemming from his own narcissism about people trying to claim credit for Republican policies, and that's really all it is, that still has the initial problem. What is a Trump presidency going to do with its appointees and policies and people? And a lot of it will have to be drawn from the Heritage Foundation. And in the past, he has said that the Heritage Foundation would be steering a lot of the policy, just as in his previous administration. The Federalist Society basically just handed him a list of judges they want appointed, and they got everything they wanted. It tends to be how it is with Trump. And if we look outside of just the Heritage Foundation, a lot of the more ideologically influential parts of the Republican intelligentsia, I guess we can call it, is pretty actively anti-Ukraine. We also have to look at the Claremont Institute. The Claremont Institute is a lot of the power behind what's called the quote-unquote national conservative movement that Trump is drawing from. And Claremont and its various publications, it's kind of more of a network or web than just that one institution. It's all been consistently anti-Ukraine and Ukraine aid, and it often explicitly supporting some of Russia's talking points and goals with the Ukraine war, especially regarding, say, religion. And then there's the whole kind of weird little community of explicitly and exclusively pro-Trump think tanks and that have popped up since his previous presidency, such as like AFPAC, America First Political Action Conference, and others that are, again, very deep into this quote-unquote national conservative movement that is anti-Ukraine.
It's really not exaggerating to say that overall, while there is a kind of split of opinion in the Republican Party itself, the MAGA wing of the party, which is ascendant and which is obviously Trump's own movement, is incredibly anti-Ukraine, to an extent even beyond the kind of typical conservative stance of being against foreign aid in general, they really do hate Ukraine personally. They really do think Russia is right and that larger, more powerful countries should have the right to interfere in smaller countries around them if they so choose. They fundamentally agree with that viewpoint. There is no way to kind of wriggle around that because fundamentally they think might makes right. They can't really formulate a strong or even coherent pro-Ukraine stance because they really do fundamentally believe that might makes right. So obviously the bigger the country, the more nukes, the more right you have to mess with anyone who doesn't do as you say. And if they're small neighbors, well, sucks to be you. This is the same kind of train of thought that gets us prominent MAGA philosophers. I don't know what you call them. The thinkers, though I don't think it's the same kind of train of thought that leads them to say we should invade Mexico to end drug crime. Just we're bigger. We have more guns. We have the right to invade sovereign countries.
And that's not to again, it's not to say the entire Republican Party is in line with this. The Heritage Foundation's
very explicitly, this is the kind of MAGA stance on it all. There are branches of the Republican Party that are not ascendant, branches once represented by folks like Mitt Romney and John McCain, who have a more, let's say, idealistic idea of what America's role in the world should be. And they often will have a pretty fervent pro-Ukraine stance. But unfortunately, they have been sidelined in the party.
Yeah, Heritage Foundation's main rival is the American Enterprise Institute, and they have been much more Ukraine-friendly, but at the same time, not as good of a relationship with the MAGA wing of the party. Mike Pompeo, Trump's former Secretary of State, did put out a plan for supporting Ukraine, but at the same time, you don't really hear much about him anymore. And which brings us now to the Republican National Convention, the big party where they decided to name Trump the next Republican nominee. And when I say party, what I mean is everyone who went there and watching it, myself, parts of it, there were more musical acts than there were speeches. The speeches were real short and the musical acts were real long. So it was much more of a big kind of right-wing concert than a political event. But just starting talking about Ukraine there, because you can get the news of what else happened there from other people. And we can say that it was not much of a topic. There were signs saying end the war, which according to the Trump plan, his own plan is called Agenda 47 because he'd be the 47th president. And
though I will note, amusingly, Agenda 47 only has 46 points.
It's very silly. It's very short. It's whenever they write anything Trump related, they do it in Trump voice, which makes it very odd to read. Lots of caps lock going on. But one of these points is end the war. It does not say how to do that. But from other statements from Trump, where he said he'll end the war in 48 hours or whatever, it seems to boil down to, I will withdraw aid from Ukraine, and that means that Ukraine will not be able to fight and therefore be forced to the negotiating table with Russia, with the unspoken next step being that without aid, Ukraine does not exactly have much of a negotiating position and would be swiftly bulldozed by any kind of Russian negotiators.
Yeah, let's give credit where credit's due. Withdrawing military aid from Ukraine would cause us to surrender because we would lose. And that is one way of ending the war. One side wins, the war does end.
But beyond that, they've tried to kind of couch it and saying, oh, we're just going to save people's lives. But we don't need to get into that rant right now. But the actual speeches barely mentioned Ukraine. It was much more about transphobia. Transphobia seemed to be like 50% of what the speeches at the RNC consisted of, except for one, which was David Sachs. And we'll get into why he's important in a second. David Sachs, the venture capitalist, tightly connected to Peter Thiel, and we have a lot to go talk about there. He gave a speech listing every possible pro-Russian talking point and how Ukraine is bad and Russia is correct, and just being a general nuisance. David Sachs, also the close confidant of Elon Musk. And reports from the ground said it did not get a very warm reception. Others said that, well, people still clapped. Like, what he was saying was not being opposed. They just don't care as much about Ukraine in any direction as much as they care about hating people in the United States. But then the big announcement, the thing that was actually important for that, is that Trump needed a vice president. And there had been quite a bit of discussion behind the scenes about who such a vice president would be. In the American political system, the vice president doesn't actually do much. They exist in case the president dies. And if there is a tied vote in the Senate, he casts the winning vote. That's the extent of his formal powers. But the actual position of vice president, its informal powers vary greatly from president to president. During the George Bush administration, Dick Cheney probably had more influence on the government than George Bush himself. Often they are used to, quote unquote, balance the ticket. If your presidential candidate really grabbed onto this segment of your voters, then you pick a vice president who is from a different segment of the voters.
This is why, for example, the VP pick for Democratic nominee Kamala Harris will likely be someone milquetoast from the Midwest who is white and male, because as a Black woman, she galvanizes a certain segment of the electorate, and she needs someone else at her side who can galvanize a different segment of the electorate.
Obama, the young Black man, needed Biden, the wizened old white guy statesman, to balance his ticket. Trump needed the conservative Christians to balance out the brash New York guy, although very quickly it turned out that all the conservative Christians loved him more anyway, so that didn't especially matter. So did Trump want to do that? Did he want to balance out the ticket? And reporting from behind the scenes seemed to imply that was originally the case. There was some governor like that was trusted that was supposed to be sliding into the VP role until, I guess, Trump's sons threw in a new name, which was JD Vance. And now we'll have to talk about the rich vein that is all kinds of bullshit that relates to JD Vance. JD Vance himself is a product of the political machinations of Peter Thiel. And in this case, I think that someone who understands Ukrainian politics understands American politics a little bit better because of it. In American politics, we are often slow to talk about oligarchic networks of here's a rich guy who funds a variety of candidates and think tanks to extend his influence into politics. Americans like to talk about ideology more than network a lot of the time, whereas Ukrainians are much more comfortable talking about here's this oligarch, he owns that guy, and that guy. And in this case, Peter Thiel owns JD Vance. JD Vance came up as one of his employees. But first, we'll talk about what Peter Thiel represents. The political power of him and his networks, and the troubling ideological roots that they may have. So in the early 90s, late in the 80s, there was something developing called the quote-unquote California ideology, taken from the name of a book from 1994, 1995, early 90s, that basically described how within the San Francisco political system, there was a new idea that was being passed around the tech industry. This involved a lot of influence from 60s counterculture, a lot of a bit more social progressivism than a lot of the country was at the time, but also at the same time being incredibly pro-corporate, very anti-labor, and very much based around the idea that there are these titans of industry who just see better than the rest of us, and we just have to get out of their way to let them drive us into a techno-utopian future. So think Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, that kind of guy. So economically very libertarian in that way. But nestled within that, one of the most ideological members of the San Francisco scene at the time was Peter Thiel, who took things in a much more conservative direction. But to understand Peter Thiel, we have to look at PayPal. He was most famous for being the figure at the center of PayPal. A lot of you have used PayPal. It's one of the most common payment processing services that you can use. But at the time, they kind of saw it as an alternative form of banking that the government couldn't touch. That is not how it actually developed, but that is how these kind of techno-libertarians at the start of PayPal imagined it as being.
Now, there was definitely a need at the time for some sort of secure online payment mechanism, and that hadn't been developed. While the dot-com boom and bust kind of killed the first iteration of e-commerce, anyone with a brain in the mid 90s, early 2000s could see that e-commerce was obviously what everyone was going to adopt, dot-com bust or no. And there was no real secure and accepted and trusted method for online payments at the time. The media was awash in hacker-related scare stories of hackers ruining the whole families by swiping their credit card details or their checks or whatever. And the technology really wasn't there to verify a lot of these online payments. Check fraud was incredibly easy to do back then because systems simply had no way of pinging a bank and finding out if a check is legit or not. None of that existed. So there was definitely this wide open space for someone to invent basically a secure and trusted payments portal or payment processor. And unfortunately for humanity, the people that ended up making that particular thing were Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and David Sacks. They weren't the only ones, but they were incredibly prominent, instrumental, and we are still dealing with the consequences of that to this day.
Well, they're the ones who are most relevant to this episode anyway. The PayPal Mafia, as it was called, because PayPal was such an important and central figure, the Silicon Valley world. The alumni of the PayPal Mafia went on to be important to Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Reddit, a lot of what we now see as the modern internet. A PayPal guy either founded it or someone else founded it and they brought in a PayPal guy to run it. So there was this extensive network. And unfortunately, at the center of that network was a very rotten ideology. And Peter Thiel, well, his background was not exactly rich to create the best person in the world. His parents, they were Germans in Namibia who were kind of the managerial caste of apartheid when Namibia was under South African control. So compared that to Elon Musk and even David Sacks, we have a lot of South African apartheid rich people, which not great can come from that well. And Thiel was an ideologue of a kind of conservative libertarianism. At least that's how it was on the surface of it. Though what other people saw was that there's this very famous figure in San Francisco to the point where if you see TV shows and movies about this era in Silicon Valley, there will frequently be a character that's a direct parody of Peter Thiel. And one of his first political, at least publicly, presentations was a book that he wrote with David Sacks called The Diversity Myth, which made the argument that all these corporate programs of hiring minorities were bad for companies, which is something that we still hear today with all the stuff about DEI or whatever new term that they're using to complain about at the time. And he began to fund a lot of politicians who agreed with his idea of him not ever having to pay taxes and him being able to do whatever he wants. And that includes hiring white people more than anything else. But it gets worse, because while that was the public face of it, the ideological influences that they shared among themselves were much, much darker.
This comes out of this California ideology that Anthony had referred to earlier. But this California ideology, for a lot of these Silicon Valley tech people, it was before their time. The essay that dubbed the term came out in the mid-90s. And a lot of tech people were only coming of age at the end of the 2000s. And obviously they weren't going to buy into whatever was written when they were 5 years old. So instead, they were developing their own closely related, but still kind of separate ideology. And this is where we get into kind of the founding of the internet and transhumanism. When the internet was created and started seeing adoption in the United States, people communicated primarily through things known as news groups. These were basically giant email chains that people would contribute to, and you can scroll back and read the history of it, kind of like a forum thread, and BBSs. And for a lot of these up and coming Silicon Valley people, they were really into transhumanism, this kind of philosophical belief that when technology provides a way for humans to modify their own bodies, humans should take complete advantage of this and discard their biological forms. And out of the kind of transhumanism news groups and these newsletters that these people were contributing to and a part of, grew a number of online communities. One of them was Extropians, where a lot of these ideologies really started to crystallize. So around the end of the aughts, this is already kind of into the modern internet. A lot of these kids who grew up reading these in these news groups and dreaming of this science fiction future began moving to Silicon Valley, to San Francisco. They began to network. They had computer science jobs, etc. And a couple of, I guess, thinkers kind of developed out of this milieu, one of which was a guy known as Eliezer Yudkowsky, who wrote a really stunning amount of words on an idea that he called rationalism. In his view, in Yudkowsky's view, rationalism was not so much an ideology as a way of thinking to make the best bets that you can. It sounds a bit weird when I put it that way, but pretty much Yudkowsky was obsessed with figuring out and teaching people how to think better, basically, to think more clearly, to think more logically, to think more rationally, and where we get the name rationalism. Now, not all of what Yudkowsky's wrote, and actually very little of what Yudkowsky wrote, is strictly ideological, but considering the community that he was in and interacted with and the people that he was interacting with, it was impossible to separate some vestiges of ideology from all of this writing. And Yudkowsky actually made a very strong effort to keep at least his core beliefs, what they call the sequences, the core of his writings about rationalism, non-ideological. However, there were people in the rationalist community that didn't agree, that they were like, well, we clearly think better. Rationalism was very much a movement that did not put a lot of stock into modern science, despite the fact that they considered themselves rationalists. They very much considered academia to be utterly worthless and distorted by perverse incentives, yada, yada, yada. And so you started to have these people in this rationalist community. And when I say community, I don't just mean an online community or like a fandom. These people really lived, basically, they were all neighbors in San Francisco. Like the core of this community, they all lived in San Francisco, very often in group homes, which is what Yudkowsky encouraged, and totally not a cult, you guys. Narrator voice, a cult. But they wanted more ideology to it. They wanted more things, more calls to action. And out of this started developing something called the Dark Enlightenment. So in Yudkowsky's writings, he talks about the dark triad of personality traits, things like sociopathy, persuasiveness, and so on, that Yudkowsky considered to be kind of detrimental to the existence and survival of the human race, but that he nevertheless praised for as an example of people acting rationally to achieve the aims that they want. So it kind of was no surprise when you began having thinkers associated with this rationalist community start kind of vomiting words about what they called the Dark Enlightenment, neo-reactionism. That is, they considered the old conservative movements to be hopelessly out of date, out of touch and capable of relating to the modern world. But these guys, no, they were the new enlightenment, the dark enlightenment. They were neo-reactionaries. They had a really great idea of how society should be organized. And one of their main writers was a guy named Curtis Yarvin, who went by the pen name of Mencius Moldbug. And this man wrote a lot. It's hard to overstate how much he writes. He writes so much. And I challenge our listeners to read anything that Moldbug has ever written, because it is quite frankly impossible. I have read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason almost cover to cover. I won't claim the entire thing, but a good chunk of it. And it is clearer and easier to get through than anything Moldbug has ever vomited onto a page. His kind of core belief, and the reason that his this ideology started to gain traction with the California ideology, Silicon Valley types, the guys who actually had the money. Because right now we're talking about a community of basically nerds. They're just fanboys with sci-fi ideas who wanted to be rich and cool, but weren't yet. And so the community kind of tailored itself to appeal to people who do have money, the aforementioned California, the PayPal mafia people. And so Moldbug began pushing this idea that democracy is done. It's been tried. Most people are too genetically inferior to really be participatory agents in a democratic system. And the whole idea needs to be scrapped. So obviously you replace it with monarchy. So Moldbug begins tailoring and espousing the virtues of monarchy, the old Platonic ideal of the philosopher kings. And I might say this with derision, but I would like our listeners to understand Moldbug was being utterly and completely sincere. This is what he believed and what he wanted other people in his community, other people in Silicon Valley to also believe. Basically, he wanted a corporate monarchist system where CEOs are basically god kings who make policy with no interference from the state, who are in fact the state, that there is no state anymore. It always has the classic libertarian ideas of minimize the state, reduce it to just contract enforcements and so on. And this is a better way of protecting people's rights than democracy, which again allows too many genetic inferiors and women to participate. And remember, that's a bad thing. As a result, rationalism and Moldbug did begin to gain the attention of the people in Silicon Valley with the money and the power. Because it turns out when you tell a rich tech CEO that not only is everything that rich tech CEO believes is true, he should literally be the god king of the world. Rich tech CEOs are usually narcissistic enough to admire that and to give people money. And this is what it's all about. It's all about, as we call it, wingnut welfare. It's these people needed some way of supporting themselves, and the way they did it is by sucking up the tech CEOs to give them money. And Thiel was not just supporting Moldbug, not just supporting Yudkowsky. He funded a really wide variety of think tanks, of institutes, of projects. He gave grants. He at least tried to invest in some of the companies founded by these people. Most of those companies failed because these people are not that good at their jobs. He was a true believer. It looks like, from what we can tell, he still is a true believer in this whole thing, which is, by the way, one of the reasons I am an ex-rationalist and not a current rationalist. Once they started talking about the bell curve and IQ, I just noped the hell out of there.
Yeah, as someone who was on the internet in the 2000s, I'm definitely familiar with a lot of the various strains of, techno-libertarianism and all that. I did not get as deep into the Yarvinite stuff, but I was familiar with it. If you were on the forums in the 2000s, it was something that you saw.
It was pretty much an idea or a set of beliefs, an ideology tailor-made to appeal to a certain kind of American nerd in a certain time period. And that describes most of Silicon Valley at the time, and still a good chunk of Silicon Valley now. They kind of lost the rails a bit when they started trying to focus on AI risk and effective altruism, when all these really got, the oligarchs realized that when they're funding all of these kind of side projects, they're not advancing their main goal, which is to make sure they never have to pay $1 of tax ever in their entire existence. So Moldbug was one of the main ideologues here. And again, he wrote so much and so poorly, but because he wrote so much, and I do mean so much, and he wrote so densely, people started considering his works as kind of foundational, as the revelations of a true modern thinker, instead of what they actually were, which was the kind of random rantings of a guy who really needs to learn how to edit.
And I'll say here that a part of his writings did include stuff on Ukraine. And as you could imagine, the guy who hates democracy has a bit of a soft spot for Russian imperialism. In his ideology, there are two Ukraines that he doesn't consider to be real. One of them is Malorus, Little Russia, which includes Kiev and Odessa that are just regions of Russia, while Lviv is the center of something called Ruthenia that is basically just a bunch of dumb peasants who thought they were a country, and he doesn't know how to account for them. During the build up to the invasion, he was talking about how, quote, invading this quote unquote Ukraine, but stopping at the 1914 borders of Imperial Russia would be incredibly based and a pragmatic move by Putin. The rest of Ruthenia would rapidly fill with all the nomadic Ukrainian globalists. He also wrote an essay on how the war against Ukraine was a war against quote unquote national liberalism, and basically just the various ideas of the liberal West that were being defeated. So not exactly a friendly ideology when it comes to Ukraine, largely because he sees Imperial Russia as a model.
Yeah, mind you, Yarvin has only grown more right-wing as time has gone on. He's moved away from a lot of kind of the sci-fi or techno-libertarian aspects to just sort of bog standard far right talking points, which has kind of lessened the influence that rationalism used to have over or this dark enlightenment neo-reactionary stuff that it had over Silicon Valley, but it has been more in line with what his oligarch backers want to hear.
Yeah, so this is kind of the semi-official court philosophy of Peter Thiel. It is what David Sachs listens to, which I believe is a lot of the reason why David Sachs became one of the most anti-Ukraine people out there. This is who Elon Musk was listening to, although in the PayPal mafia, Elon Musk was always considered one of the less bright people, and Thiel didn't exactly respect him in that way. But it's the earth from which these people grow. It is the general ideas that they are pushing. And that includes one JD Vance. So who is JD Vance? Well, one thing to keep in mind here that a lot of this PayPal mafia, a lot of the people connected to it, including Yarvin, are not American standard issue white boys. And that will make it harder to advance in some places in conservative politics. Yarvin is Jewish. David Sachs is Jewish. Like I said, Sachs, Musk, and Thiel are all South African and have the South African accent. Vance, however, portrays himself as a good old boy from Appalachia.
He's not, though.
He's not. JD Vance, he wasn't in Yale. He's a Yaley law school, where he attended a lecture by Peter Thiel, where Thiel explained that the future is not in law, it's in tech. And all the best smart boys should go do tech. And he listened to this, which is why after he graduated, he went to work at a place called Mithril Capital. And keep in mind that Thiel, as a nerd, named most of his companies after things from Lord of the Rings. For example, his company Palantir, which is named after the orb in Lord of the Rings used by Saruman to spy on people and communicate with Sauron, is now the name of Palantir Technologies, which is used by governments to spy on dissidents.
Yes, he literally named his surveillance company after the surveillance tool used by the bad guys in Lord of the Rings.
So Vance grew up in this venture capital world in the Thiel verse, where he went through ideological training that we just talked about. But he needed something special about him. So keep in mind that this was now 2016, and Trump just won. And a lot of people were very confused of how he could win. All the polls were saying he was going to lose. All the media thought he was going to lose. Yet he won. So we had to think of a reason why. So there was all these journalists who would go to a Denny's in Ohio and talk to whoever was there and say, well, why do you like Trump? They did parachute journalism into Midwest diners. A very embarrassing time period, and they've not gotten much better since. And the one who really won this era in the media was Vance, because he wrote a little book called The Hillbilly Elegy. Hillbilly Elegy was kind of put forward as an explanation for why Trump people were Trump people. And now I'm going to dig into Hillbilly Elegy, as many people have. As we go into this, let me just say that there is a whole cottage industry of explaining why Hillbilly Elegy was stupid. So in this book, he describes his upbringing. He is from a Rust Belt town in Ohio, but his grandmother was from Appalachia, and he would often visit her in Appalachia, and he would tell the stories of growing up amongst the Appalachians. He really pushed himself as a guy who is from this part of America that is very unique. Now, a lot of our audience is American, and you'll probably understand what I'm about to say, but a lot of them aren't, so I feel like we do need to describe, why did Vance attach himself to Appalachia, and why was that considered such a boon to his career?
So first, it probably helps to define what Appalachia is. Roughly speaking, it's a geographic area that corresponds to the range of the Appalachian Mountains in the kind of southeastern part of the United States of America.
Yeah, stretching from western Pennsylvania down to about Georgia. And really what it is that it's synonymous with white poverty, specifically white poverty. And if you are to look at a map of the United States, a data map that will explain to you poverty rates, poor health outcomes, poor education outcomes, all the bad things, you'll see three things. One of them is the Black Belt to the Deep South, the area in the country that had the most slave plantations and what continues to have the highest concentration of African Americans. Next is native reservations. As you look at the map of all the bad things, you'll see little dots, especially throughout the West. Those dots are native reservations, very grim places, lots of poverty. And the third thing is Appalachia, very poor region. Lots of health problems, lots of poverty. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that once upon a time, it relied entirely on the coal industry, and the coal industry is basically dead. But even then, if you look back to the earliest days of America, the country kind of developed around it. It's hard to build stuff in mountains. This goes for a lot of places in the world. Where there are a mountain range, there will be slower access to roads and all the kind of benefits of infrastructure and all that. Things went to the Midwest. Things went further west than Appalachians. Like electricity did not come to the Appalachian region until very late compared to the rest of the country. And there's always been an effort to explain what makes Appalachia so unique compared to the rest of the country. And one thing that Vance definitely leaned into in his book, Hillbilly Elegy, is this kind of historical ethnic explanation for it. So there are a bunch of books on this. Probably the most famous is something called Albion's Seed. And in Albion's Seed, it describes how different parts of the U.S. developed different customs, cultures based on what part of the British Isles settled there. So in New England, a lot of the people were Puritans from southeastern England who supported the parliamentarians in the English Civil War, and because of that had stronger ideas about equality and democracy and that kind of thing. Virginia was settled by the aristocracy and came with more ideas of a ruling class that was better educated and higher cultured, that had the right to have political rulership over everyone else. Appalachia was settled largely by poorer regions of Great Britain, and so the borderlands between Scotland and England, where there was a lot of violence, where there is a lot of clan-based social structures, lots of raids. And so, according to this idea of things, they took that to the U.S. So very famously, for example, there was the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys that even in its own day was a huge media sensation. This is also settled by Protestants from Northern Ireland, same thing, a lot of conflict there. And basically what it's trying to say is that these people are naturally violent. That is one way to read this ideology, to the point where it kind of become America's own version of Orientalism. Orientalism, the description of describing Eastern cultures as being like wholly different from Western cultures with their own ideas that made them more prone to despotism and all that. We kind of had that in the US, where we said that we had these mountain folk who just had inherent cultural qualities that made them less civilized. It's very interesting because even with the Hatfields and McCoys, like I said, that was already a media sensation in its day. All these people from New York and the big cities were looking at these hill folk as being, isn't it funny how these people are so weird?
So one of the things that Vance did, so in opposition, he really framed the memoir as this almost semi-anthropological study of this exotic region of the U.S. that few people are, and obviously, which is like bullshit.
This is very offensive. I want to say this is an offensive portrayal of Appalachia.
Yeah, he really makes it seem like these are inherent qualities of the people who live there and not, a result of anything else. It's just so in the U.S., for our non-U.S. listeners, in the US, there is this idea of white trash, basically white people who aren't properly white. They're not fully civilized. They, don't wash. They live in rundown settlements. They don't care about anything outside of themselves. They're stupid. They aren't capable of proper critical thinking and so on. This is a very widespread belief. And Hillbilly Elegy pretty much says that not only are poor whites a real thing and white trash, not only is that a real thing, it's an ethnic group that dominates this area. And that's why everyone is like, and again, I'm really not exaggerating. This is more or less the conclusion that Vance wants his readers to come to.
It was definitely taken positively in both the right wing and liberal media spheres for very different reasons. On the right, basically Vance made the argument that the reason why this region was poor is that they're a bunch of lazy drug addicts who don't want to work. And that is what Republicans like hearing. The poor people deserve to be poor because they're bad people. And a lot of the time it is racialized as saying like the welfare queen, the black people are poor because black people are inherently inferior in some way, so they deserve it. And this allowed them to say that, yes, white poor people also deserve to be poor, not just black people. See, we're not racist. Whereas on the liberal side of things, people really felt the need after the victory of Trump to tell themselves that they were still better. So why are Trump voters Trump voters? Because
they're all white trash inbred hicks. All right. You don't have to think about it too hard. Don't look into any reasons here. They're all inbred hicks who don't have chins and haven't been able to engage in literacy for the past 3 generations. That's why. No need to do any more research. JD Vance has solved it.
He became very famous for this idea in a lot of very bad ways. And before we move on, though, I really want to say that, again, this is not why. The reason why Appalachia is poor is because that it was chronically neglected by central governments, not only in DC, but also in, Richmond and Nashville, because all the wealth was in the mountains. There was coal in them their hills, and they took all that wealth, extracted it, and did not leave a whole lot behind. It was in some ways very similar to colonialism. It was kind of an interior colonialism of a part of the United States. And when the industry went away, they left shattered region behind it. And in many ways, corporations ran rampant throughout Appalachia, where at times, quite literally, if you were too deep into debt, your wife would have to sell herself into prostitution by the companies in order to cover the debts of just having a house that was owned by the company. Like, very dark stuff happened to these people.
The worst kind of excesses of the West boom, the mining towns, the company towns. This was like the worst of it happened in Appalachia because it is so mountainous. It is difficult to navigate. And so the companies and the coal barons could really just treat that land as their own private fiefdoms. The central government and even state governments barely look because it was really difficult to go there. It cost a lot of money back then. And what was the point? Like, try and get taxes from a bunch of people who probably hate the central government. Like, a lot of people moved out there not just to staff the company towns, but also that was a draw, but also because it was a way to get away from the federal government. It was a way, go run in and live in the woods, live in the mountains. There was this very strong independence streak that led to this area being incredibly isolated and neglected and ignored by everyone, which leads to massive exploitation.
So why do these people vote for Trump? Because they're mostly conservative people, conservative social beliefs. And Trump's big pitch to them was that he would bring back the coal industry. The liberals are trying to destroy it because of environmentalism. Trump would bring it back. He did not. So what happens after the publishing of Elegy? Now he's not just a rich San Francisco VC guy, but now he is one of the official Trump whisperers of the country and had all this fame and eventually ran for the Senate in 2022. And his run for the Senate was one of the most expensive Senate runs ever, wholly backed by Peter Thiel. And in his time since then, well, I had a lot of notes on this, but I'm just going to run down it in list form because each of these points is...
It would take we could literally dedicate 2-hour episodes to each of the points that we were about to list, and it still would not really cover in its entirety.
Yeah, so he won, and at the time, he was also, him and another guy named Blake Masters were the two big Thiel candidates of that year. Blake Masters was much more forwardly a white nationalist, white supremacist, while Vance hung back a little bit, but only a little bit. Because in his time in politics, he has found a way to connect himself to pretty much every element of the dissident right, or far right, alt-right, whatever term that people want to use right now.
I believe the polite term is fascists.
Fascists, yes. Every little subcategory of fascist somehow he found his way into, in either major form or a minor form. We already talked about Curtis Yarvin, and that is where he's from. He is very, very heavily influenced by Curtis Yarvin, and there's lots of think pieces out right now because, as I was watching the RNC and seeing how it was very obviously a Thiel production, I figured, by tomorrow there's going to be 80 think pieces about Peter Thiel, and that turned out to be correct. And so Vance, very heavily influenced by Curtis Yarvin. He's also very tightly connected into the Claremont Institute that we talked about earlier as this very, very anti-Ukraine think tank. He's also connected to Charles Murray, a race scientist who talks about how black people are just mentally inferior to white people.
You may have heard of this little book called The Bell Curve. Murray is one of the main authors on that book, and the book's whole shtick is attempting to, using poor science and cherry-picked examples. There are rebuttals, comprehensive ones of Bell Curve, but basically it boils down to non-whites are just mentally inferior to whites.
He did a podcast with one Jack Murphy who said that feminists need to be raped. He is a very much he's Catholic, which is kind of sets him apart from a lot of the dark enlightenment where he fully embraced it to kind of Catholic integralism of the kind that kind of turned into fascism in France and Italy and Croatia.
They're sort of atheists, but they call themselves like Catholic or Orthodox or whatever for, I'm assuming, clout points.
It, like we said, these are nerds. And when you see Catholic with like the full regalia, it makes you look like you're like an RPG character. And that's why they went with Catholicism as opposed to Protestantism.
Well, sometimes some of them went Orthodox.
Or Orthodox, yeah. The Ortho Bros as well. Same category. And he's influenced by people such as Rene Girard and Patrick Deneen, who are staunchly anti-liberal, who want the liberal order to destroy it and be replaced with, again, a form of neo-reactionary, a reactionary ideology. And again, there's so much to say about these people. He was also tied into the kind of Hungarian clique of conservatives. I think I've been kind of tossing around an idea of basically what's going on in Hungary as an episode. And part of that is that there is a group of American conservatives who, some of them have straight up moved to Hungary, but are in some form connected to the government of Viktor Orban and what he calls illiberal democracy. So we might keep some democracy stuff, but liberalism as a whole needs to be tossed out. Central among them is a guy named Rod Dreher that he took a really weird photo with, whereas with like Rod Dreher's wife, and they covered it with like a clam because he loves clams more than his ex-wife. Weird people. He is tied into one Jack Posobiec, the guy who is largely behind the Pizzagate scandal, the belief that the Democrats were torturing children in the basement of a pizza restaurant, and who has since become one of the main anti-Ukraine, pro-Russia influencers in kind of the American right wing. He has been photographed with Groypers, aka Nazis. He follows Bronze Age pervert, and I don't want to talk about Bronze Age pervert. As you can tell, his name is in reflection of his beliefs. Basically everything. He is connected to every bad thing on the right. And the important thing to say here is with Hillbilly Elegy, that's where he kind of got the image of a guy who doesn't really believe stuff. Like he'll just kind of cater his idea. He's not a believer. He's just an opportunist. And that's not the full story.
Yeah, Hillbilly Elegy was very much seen by the liberal class in the United States as like hard-hitting, truth-telling journalism, which gave Vance a status not really held or seen in other kind of far-right figures.
Beyond that, like, he believes this stuff. He is a creature of the far right. He's only a little bit
actually
older.
Does believe in it.
He's only a little bit older than us, actually. He's 39. I'm 35. And so, like we were talking about, we witnessed the rise of the Dark Enlightenment, all that. I know what goes into a guy like JD Vance. I've seen him a million times. He's not just an opportunist. He's a believer in some very, very nasty things. So what are some of these nasty things on Ukraine? And I wrote an article about this when it came out at one point. Actually, don't remember if I published it, but he is the most anti-Ukraine member of the U.S. Senate. How it works in the U.S. is that often the real firebrands will be in the House of Representatives. The Senate was a bit more even-keeled, and he was an exception to that for all the reasons that we just explained for the past long time. There are people that are perhaps even more anti-Ukraine than him, such as Rand Paul. But Rand Paul is kind of set aside from the real power players in the Republican Party, more so than Vance, who, he was just made VP, so obviously he's tied in. And he opposed every bill to support Ukraine. He has often repeated pro-Russia talking points. And immediately before the full-scale invasion, he gave the quote, "I gotta be honest with you, I don't really care what happens in Ukraine one way or another." A lot of his more recent arguments have been not so much explicitly about hating Ukraine, but saying that, well, America can't help either way. The war is decided. Russia's going to win. Every bit of money we spend in Ukraine is a waste, so let's just not do that. And this is also tied into one idea among the Republicans that if we get Russia on America's side, they can help us against China. And that's an absurd belief that I don't fully understand why they think that will work. They saw Nixon as bringing China on sides against the Soviet Union and want to do a reverse of that, but whatever. So that's where JD Vance stands now. We began this discussion about who would be in Trump's court, who would be the ones appointing people, who would be the ones in the ear of a man who really is very easily distracted and often will just believe whatever it is the last person who he spoke to told him to believe. And in this case, would be Vance. That's scary. Now, we talked a bit before about how Trump has come out against Project 2025 at times because he's too much of a narcissist to share credit.
Also, Project 2025 has some deeply weird things that when the media chooses to focus on them, turns off even moderate Republicans. It is a deeply, deeply far right proposal that is kind of out of step with just general America. And it looks bad. It looks bad. When the media writes about the weird things that Project 2025 has and links it to Trump, it makes Trump seem weird and bad, which Trump does not like. He wants to seem cool and mainstream.
And we're going to see the same weakness in the Republicans with Vance because he is deeply weird.
He is so weird, you guys.
He's so weird. We just talked for a very long time about how weird he is. I hope you're still sticking with us.
And again, we barely scratched the surface of how weird this dude is.
And so there are some whispers that Trump may be slightly not happy with his pick of Vance. When you just say the things that Vance believes, a normal person thinks to themselves, wow, that guy's a creepy weirdo. And that seems to be his reaction right now. He's not very popular.
For example, Vance said, I believe the other day on an interview that he thinks that families with more children should be given votes based on the number of children they have, which in his circles, I'm sure is a perfectly normal belief to hold. But for everyone else is just like batshit.
Trump has the element of being able to hide behind his bravado and his boisterousness that he can say whatever he wants and people are fine with it. But when other people around him are weird, they don't have the same aura to them that protects them from that. But on the flip side, who does Trump replace him with? Who does Trump replace Project 2025 with? These are the people that stand behind him. And like we said at the start of this episode or this segment, the president does not control the government. The court, the imperial court of the president, the people he chooses, the people who influence him, the advisors, the secretaries, those who are the ones who really steer the country. And all this stuff we've said about these think tanks, about Vance, those are the people who are turning Trump's head in the direction that they want him to look in. And that is how you control Trump. And for Ukraine, that is very, very dangerous. So we just talked about Republicans in what is now going to be perhaps our longest episode, but we still do have to talk about the Democrats because in a very history-making event, Biden decided to drop out of the race. The reason for this is mostly comes down to his age. He is a very old man, and that was really beginning to show, especially in the last few months. I'd say that even last year, he was looking pretty fine, but it kind of came to a head at his first debate where he was looking tired and just doesn't have it in him. And when he stepped down, he decided to endorse his vice president, Kamala Harris, as who he thought should be the next U.S. president. And within about a 24-hour span of time, the entirety of the Democratic Party agreed with him. We're talking all the politicians, all the donor groups, the unions, very swiftly said, yes, this is correct, which led me and most others to believe that this was happening behind the scenes for some time, probably at least since the debate, and they just needed to get all the pieces in place to make the transition. Because it was very, very swift and pretty dramaless. And the only question now is who her vice president would be. And like we mentioned earlier, that will likely be what inoffensive white boy are they going to choose?
The best option for Ukraine would probably be Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. Kelly has made multiple trips to Kyiv in recent years. He has been one of the most prominent Senate members pushing for greater aid and less restrictions on that aid. for Ukraine. And there's absolutely no doubt that if he was chosen as VP and if he did become VP, he would push forward pro-Ukraine policies as much as he has as a senator. However, most of the other VP candidates are at least okay on Ukraine. There are no open isolationists or anything like that. Most of them would probably be content to follow whatever policy the president would set down. Harris herself is kind of a cipher in this regard because she never really had the sort of national profile where she would need to develop a concrete foreign policy, though I imagine that's going to be happening now.
Biden has been at the game for decades, which proved to be his weakness in this case. He has been very active in foreign policy. He was a big hand in the Yugoslav conflicts, where he very famously called to bomb Serbia, which was the correct call to do, and has really been a national figure, a national politician, whereas Kamala Harris has largely been a California politician until being made VP. So she does not have the same, and like we were talking about, it's all about networks. Biden had the networks. Kamala Harris really didn't. She's much more of a domestic politics person. But what we do know of her foreign policy team right now is that her foreign policy advisor, her national security advisor, Phil Gordon, is very much a Russia hawk. He has called for much more intense opposition to Russia and much more support for Ukraine, more so even than many of the people on the Biden team. And this is all, whispers and rumors. But of course, with any presidential transition, there's going to be a turnover in appointees. But some of the people who are less good for Ukraine in the Biden administration, such as Jake Sullivan, are again rumored to be the first on the way out. So likely Harris would be in most ways a continuation of Biden policy with some improvements, at least on staffing, which would most likely involve improvements on policy as well. So good for her. Earlier today, I saw that she was endorsed even by the commander of the Georgian Legion. So enthusiasm in Ukraine for her.
Yeah, Harris doesn't have a lot of the kind of baggage that ties Biden to such a meek response to Russia. She doesn't have this sort of obsession with statesmanship and so on, and great powers that have sort of formed or shaped Biden's political outlook. She's much more dynamic, and there are very good chances that the people she surrounds herself with will be much fiercer and much stricter on Russia than Biden has been, which of course is only good news, though she does have to win first.
And she has seen some rapid advances in the polls, although the polls are very weird this time around, so I can't put much confidence in them either way. There does seem to be a huge enthusiasm boost. It seemed that a lot of the problem with the Democratic Party ticket was just lack of enthusiasm about Biden. His age, some of his decisions around Israel, for example, and broadly just not being a very exciting guy. And there does seem to be more excitement about Harris. So we'll see. The outlook has definitely gotten better, especially for Ukraine, but it will develop quickly. Next up will be the Democratic conference where the official choice for VP is made. There'll probably be some kind of boost from that, but there's still quite a bit of time between now and November. Please vote Democrat. Ukraine Without Hype officially endorsing the Harris/whoever she chooses ticket, because otherwise things get very, very bad here for us and everyone we love.
There is no overstating how much of a threat Donald Trump is to Ukraine and how much damage his presidency would cause. It would very likely lead to Ukraine's surrender in the war, simply because Trump has explicitly said that that is his plan for ending the war, is to force Ukraine to surrender to Russia. So if you are a fan of Ukraine not surrendering to the fascist invader, vote Democrat. There's really no two ways about it. Doesn't matter what else you believe. If you at all care about Ukraine, there is only one choice on the ballot this November.
So with that, I'm sure we'll give some updates throughout the campaign, but this was quite a hefty episode, so I think we've said a lot there is to say. But until then, please vote Democrat. As Hillary Clinton once said, Pokemon go to the polls. And until then, if you would like to support Ukraine and otherwise, besides supporting the Democratic Party in the United States, you can look at our link tree in our description to see resources and information about the country. If you'd like to support Ukraine without hype, please tell your friends and family about us. And honestly, I think this is a good episode to show to people because Vance, very deeply weird person, as we just described. And we really need to get the idea out there that this is an election between normal people and weirdo fascist freaks. If you'd like to support the podcast financially, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine without hype and join our list of supporters. So now I'd like to thank all of our supporters. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kokratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike Perrone, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Etienne Soleil, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Marguerite, Michael Wickman, ELM, Shieldwall, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Aiden McDonald, Alex Scrochmal, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Demetrio, Dish Taco, Emily Bavona, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Hoem, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kyle Johnson, Laura De Leon, Laurie Halila, Lemonkin, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noam Hart, Paul Bailey, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tokryuk, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Thomas Sobiek, Ursula Zolenkoff, Veronica, and Victoria Leontineva, and Wandering Lens. Thank you all very much for your support. So until next episode, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.